Lesson 13, books of Ezra and Nehemiah. This is our last lesson in history. And I know you're probably very sad about that. This is of the Old Testament history, I should say. So I'm going to begin. We're going to do a quick sweep of history. And there's two things, basic things you need to be aware of, okay? And these are the simple. So if you don't get anything else, listen to this part right now. When you think Ezra, think temple. All right? The rebuilding of the temple happens in Ezra. When you think Nehemiah, think the walls of the city. So if you just get that, you really kind of understand Ezra and Nehemiah. And then also next week, of course, we'll talk about the book of Esther. The book of Esther, as we'll see, actually takes place inside of the book of Ezra. So Esther and Ezra go together. Esther happens in the middle between chapters 6 and 7 that we'll see in just a moment. Okay, so we're going to look at this quick timeline. This is not exactly to scale, of course, but it's just important to know, and I'm going to show you some pictures in just a moment up there. As I've said over and over, remember what I've said, I'm going to keep saying it, it's easier to believe the Bible is true today than it ever has been, because of all the evidence, all the history. So these, I'll start at the bottom. These are the dates in the Bible of the events that happened. We have King David, roundabout. Now this one's a little bit flexible in the dates because of different reasons, but around 1000 BC. That round number is easy to remember. Think David, 1000 BC. Then we have David, that's the United Kingdom. In here, the kingdom divides. I didn't have room to write that, so I didn't put that one on there. And then we see at 722, Israel falls. So the northern kingdom, we saw that last week, is conquered, and it's conquered by the Assyrians. And so that's why you're going to see this. These are the empires. So Israel falls, it's about 722, and it falls to the Assyrians. The man who's mentioned in the Bible that is also mentioned in ancient scripts is this guy right here, Tiglath-Pileser. And I'm not going to show you all the pictures, but we'll look at a few of them in just a moment. So Israel falls, and you remember, of course, when he comes and attacks Judah, that's when last week we saw that God struck that huge army, and they turned around, and Assyria went back, and they were greatly weakened. And shortly after they were defeated at Judah, at Jerusalem, they were conquered by the Babylonians. And the most famous Babylonian is Nebuchadnezzar. Now, these are also historical people. And during the Babylonian time, the Babylonians come back down to Judah, to Jerusalem, and they actually conquer and destroy the city at about 587 BC. And so you think Assyrians, that's Assyrian fall, Israel, northern kingdom falls. Then about 130, 40 years later, Israel or Judah collapses and falls to the Babylonians. And then at about 539 BC, sorry, my numbers are messed up. That's an 8, but it happens immediately. We see this guy right here. Cyrus and the Persian Empire come to power, and they conquer the Babylonians. And they absorb the Babylonians. And, of course, this is a famous guy because if you've seen that battle, now, just because I mention a movie doesn't mean I'm endorsing its contents, okay? Partially for this day. But if you've seen that movie 500, or you've seen the movie Alexander the Great that came out years ago, so that they're talking about this right here. Alexander the Great, it's not Cyrus, it's one of his descendants, conquers the Persian Empire. So those battles you see in that movie are referring to these events that happened when Alexander the Great, when he's 25 years old, begins his campaign and conquers all of the known world all the way to India. But he had actually absorbed the Persian Empire. That's how he instantly became so big, because Persia, we'll look at a picture in just a second, controlled most of the known world, all the way from Europe all the way to what's modern day Pakistan and India. And so he took control over that. And then, of course, Alexander breaks down, and then he has 4 big generals, and those generals break up in different pieces, and eventually those generals form what becomes the Roman Empire, which lasts about 1,000 years, which is the longest empire in world history, really, that's ever happened in the Roman Empire. And of course, I put 0 here because that's it. We see the coming Christ. So you can see right there, this is just world history, all attested to in a different way. Now let's look at some pictures up here for the visual people like me. So this is just at this date right here, 587, Judah falls, Jerusalem falls, and this shows where they carry out. Remember what I said, that the Babylonians took out all the most important people like Daniel and all those careers influential people. They exiled them, and then they put them into different cities over here. And we'll see some of the, like Ezekiel and some of the other prophets actually lived and prophesied while they were in exile. And so this is the Babylonian Empire. And then the Babylonian Empire, we're going to see another empire pops up right here. You may have heard of the Medes and the Persians. So think of them as the same thing. The Persians actually kind of morph into that. And you see this grows. And then eventually this guy right here, Cyrus, conquers, not Nebuchadnezzar, but one of his guys that come after him, and they conquer Babylon. They immediately absorb all of this. immediately after they conquer them. And this is the amazing Persian Empire that we don't really learn a lot about, that controlled, you can imagine, all the way from Greece all the way over here to, that's the Indus Valley. So this is Pakistan and India that are right here. So that was a huge thing that was controlled by Cyrus the Great. And of course, Cyrus, the king of Persia, after he conquers Babylon, 539, 538 is when he has the decree that we're going to read in the first chapter. So we read a decree written by the king of this huge empire that sets into motion Ezra and Nehemiah, what they're about to do. And then the last picture, this is, well, you can read it right here. It's called the Cyrus cylinder. So, Cyrus, he's a character in the Bible we're going to read about today. This is an actual thing that documents, you can see inscription portrays Cyrus, the liberator of Babylon. So he showed himself as a liberator. So Cyrus came in. When he conquered Babylon, one of the first things he did to make all of his people like him is he did the same thing with the Israelites he did with a lot of people. He said, you can return to your homeland. So he frees the Babylonians and all these cities that have been built by the Babylonians and the Assyrians, bringing all these exiles. He lets all those people return. And because of a young lady named Esther, who comes along, one of his sons or one of his successors, then the Israelites get a much more higher degree of favoritism with this huge kingdom, which allows them to do a lot of things. Okay, and that brings us to the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Any questions about this before we move on? Hope that was helpful, but I just want to show you these are the big characters. I know you probably heard about them at some point or time. Yes, ma'am. Okay, well, you can still ask a question. Now, next time you're going to be nervous about adjusting. Yeah. All right. Page 57. As I said, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, if you'll look on our books here that we gave out at the beginning of the lesson, these are really the last two books of history. We'll have Esther, but as I said, Esther takes place in the book of Ezra. So we're completing this shelf. This is our last lesson on history in the Old Testament. As we saw right here, this carries us all the way up to the New Testament times. And as you see there at the top of page 57, the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther cover the last century of Old Testament history. Ezra and Nehemiah tell us of the return to Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the city, about 50 years after the fall of Jerusalem. So, and the rebuilding of the city. Nope, let me say that again. About 50 years after the fall of Jerusalem, the Jews come under the Persian rule. That's what we're talking about right here. So they get conquered 587, then about 50 years later, 539, the Babylonians collapse. They fall to the Assyrians, and then immediately the next year is when Cyrus gives a decree we're going to read in just a moment and allows them to go back to Jerusalem. So the books in Ezra give account of the Jewish return to their land and to Jerusalem, the rebuilding of the temple, and the rebuilding of the walls. And the book of Esther, which is the next one we'll look at next week, gives an account of some of the people who actually continue to live in exile. Not all the people, as we're going to see, returned. Okay, now the book of Ezra. According to these two passages you see, what were Ezra's two roles? He had two jobs. The first one was he was a skilled scribe. Now, back in those days, most people didn't know how to read and write because they didn't have books, right? So you saw how they wrote with inscriptions on clay tablets, or they did have scrolls, but paper was very, very expensive. It was really hard to make. They didn't have machines that produced them, and so there were only a handful of people that would grow up usually in the same family, which were the scribes, and those people's job was to learn how to write with very good penmanship, and they would take some of the scrolls that were getting old, and they would recopy them. And so he was one of these highly trained scribes who wrote and scribed the law of Moses. And then we see the next thing that he did along with that is that he was a priest and an expert in the law. As you can see, the name Ezra means help. But Ezra, as we're going to see in the first part, he didn't actually travel with the first group. There's a guy named Zerubbabel. Now we're going to look at this. If you have your Bible with you, looking at the first part of the book of Ezra, I'm going to read the 2nd through 4th verses. And I want you to remember this is King Cyrus, and I'll go back. Remember, this is the king over, to let you know, this was not a small town guy. This is the emperor over all this land that we're looking right here that wrote this edict that we read here in the Bible. And it says this, "Thus says the king of Persia, Cyrus, The Lord, he said, uses the word Yahweh. Isn't that interesting? He uses the name, it's all caps, Lord. Jehovah, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has appointed to me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judea, as in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may his God be with him. Let him go to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. Verse 4, it says, every survivor, at whatever place he may live, let the men of that place support him with silver, gold, with goods and cattle, together with a freewill offering for the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. So, in days when we feel really panicked and worried about world leaders, what should we remember? This, by the way, is bigger than, was probably the most powerful man, one of the most powerful men in the world, and yet God somehow, we don't know all the details of how this happened, but somehow we get hints kind of in the book of Daniel of how maybe there was influence that was there, and of course in Esther, but somehow God using these people who were in exile, just like we saw with Joseph, we see with Esther, we see with Daniel, somehow when people live according to God's ways, they become difference makers in their cultures. And I think that's what we see here in the book of Esther, is we see there's something about the ways of God, the ways of God's people, that always brings them to influence, even in these pagan kingdoms. Let me flip back to where we were now. Okay, let's flip over to page 58. And you'll see the first 6 chapters talk about a fellow named Zerubbabel. And if you've read, I know some of you are reading these books as we come to them. Let me see where it talks about, I'll make a note here. Okay, yes. Well, we'll get to that in just a second. So at the first part of the book we just read, what does the Lord move in the heart of King Cyrus? Sorry, I read that and forgot to put the verse up here. He leads him to make a proclamation to let the Jews return to Jerusalem and build the temple. And he also, you remember he says, and let any of the people who are there give golds, give any kind of offerings that they want to donate to these people who are going to return to build Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple of Jehovah. And says here, 50,000 people took advantage of the opportunity. Now, there are going to be at least 3 waves of people who are going to go. So this is the first wave of people. And they were led by a man named Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel is kind of a mysterious character. We do know that he's the grandson of Jehoiachin, as it says here, and a descendant of King David. And he was an heir, and his name is mentioned in Jesus' lineage. The reason it's mysterious is Zerubbabel is not a Jewish name. So many people speculate that, just like you'll remember Belteshazzar, that was the name given to Daniel when he moved over. So he had 2 names. And so a lot of people think that Zerubbabel was probably a name that was given to him by some of the people who carried him into exile. And then you'll see in that next phrase, in verse 7, which we're not going to read here, it says that King Cyrus gave to Sheshbazzar to take back to his homeland. Asked what did he take, and he gave a whole list of things. They're not going to list here because it's a lot of stuff. As a matter of fact, at the end of it, it says all the articles in gold and silver were numbered at 5,400. So our answer there doesn't necessarily give it justice. Gold, silver, and the vessels from the temple, and the total number of items, gold and silver, all combined together were over 5,000. 5,400 is what it says there in verse 11. And so one of the questions, if you read it, that can be a little bit confusing, is you have this guy named Sheshbazzar, and then you have a guy named Zerubbabel. And it's a little bit mysterious. No one knows for sure. Some people think they're the same guy, and it's kind of like that situation of Daniel, where he has maybe a Persian name or a Babylonian name, and then he has another name, and it's very confusing because you'll notice they're right here at this transition. So if you were in the Babylonian court, you probably went by a Babylonian name, and then the Persians came in and conquered, lots of changes, and so there's lots of names, and often these names were just titles that they were given. So because what happens is this Sheshbazzar, he sort of disappears into the scene and kind of morphs, it seems, into this guy Zerubbabel. And so there's some confusion. So there are two theories on that question, just FYI. One is it's the same guy with different names. The other one is that Sheshbazzar was the father, maybe even the adopted father, some people speculate, of Zerubbabel. So they're either the same guy or it's the son of the father. So that's the two ways that people make, but it's not expressly mentioned in Scripture there. So as it says, when the southern kingdom, that is Judah, had been taken captive 7 years before, only the upper classes were deported to Babylon. The remainder of the people had been left in Judah to farm the land. When King Cyrus decreed that these upper class Jews could go back to Jerusalem, only the earnest and faithful Jews wanted to go. We know that many of them prospered. We know that because of the book of Esther. We know that some of the Jews in exile prospered, and they probably had land and houses and esteem, and a lot of them said, why would I want to go back and start over, perhaps? And so it says they built homes and relationships there in Babylon. Then although the leaders of the remnant were of the tribe of Judah, there were some Israelites from the other tribes, but they never had their tribal identity again. And so even though they go back from this time moving forward in history, they'll never be called Israel because they're not. There are a few of the tribes, but it's the vast majority are all from the tribe of Judah. And so from this point on, they're just going to be referred to as the Jews. And so this is when it really starts, is when they come back and they rebuild Jerusalem and everything. And there are some people from the other 10 tribes. Some of them intermarried and became Samaritans. Some of them were carried in exile and returned, but there weren't many of them. So from this point on, they're just referred to as Jews. And so, as you can see, after a journey of 800 miles, bottom of page 58, what did the Jews do when they reach Jerusalem? 800 miles, that was quite a march. It says they built an altar to the Lord to offer burnt offerings. And then they, for the first time, have the Feast of Tabernacles and give free will offerings, which means they just give donations as they're beginning to rebuild for the building of the temple. And of course, this begs a question. Who can remember? I said we weren't going to have a test tonight, but this is not exactly a test. Who can remember what this feast is from our list of feasts? What was the Feast of Tabernacle? What's tabernacle? We can think that helps us. A tabernacle, remember the first tabernacle was a temporary temple. So a tabernacle simply means a temporary dwelling. It can be a tent or a hut, but it's not a permanent structure. So what would the Feast of Tabernacles be? And remember, they celebrate this all the way in the New Testament, all the way to the modern day. They still celebrate this feast. Yeah, so that's exactly what they do. It commemorates the wandering in the wilderness, and they will move out of their home, and either in their front yard, backyard, or in a park, they'll set up a tent, and they live in that tent for 7 days, and they don't eat any leavened bread, and they do all these things, and they remember that time of wandering. So you can see right here, when they come back, they finally arrive back, and I think there's this memory of almost like this is a second wandering that they've just completed after 70 years, and so they begin to reinstitute this feast of the tabernacles as they arrive in Jerusalem. But you remember, the city's destroyed. And the city walls are destroyed. So very few people probably lived inside of the city because you didn't have any protection. So people probably had built smaller little towns around with smaller walls to protect themselves. So their city was totally in ruin. So you go over to page 59. So they start the foundation of the new temple. And then some peoples approach that are called the Ezrahadins. And these are the descendants or part of what will be called the Samaritans. Now, who are the Samaritans? Who can remember who are the Samaritans from our last couple of lessons? Remember, a lot of the northern tribe got exiled, but a lot of them were left there. And then this is these people here. The Assyrians, remember the way they would subdue people is they would ship people out, and then they would ship people in to live with them. And so in those northern tribes, when the Assyrians took it over, they shipped out a lot of people, and then they shipped in a lot of foreigners that had different languages and different religions so that they couldn't unite to have any sort of rebellion or anything. And then the Samaritans were all the ones who were left over who intermarried with these foreigners, and their capital, of course, was what? Samaria. So since that was their capital city, they were called Samaritans. And as a matter of fact, under this, we didn't have this on the map, but under the Assyrian, I think Babylon Empire, there was actually a district that they made called Samaria where these people lived. So that name stuck, and of course it pops up again in the New Testament. So what is the reaction? These Samaritans, remember these are kind of sort of some of their relatives come down and say, we want to help you rebuild the temple. And what do they say? They say, no thank you, in short. I'm not quite that polite. You can see the hostilities are already there between the Jews, and already they see these Samaritans as, yeah, they are distant cousins, but they're distant cousins who have betrayed us. And now they haven't helped until now. They've kind of always fought against us. And now that we've gone to all this trouble and we brought all these things, they're kind of inconvenienced, come and say, hey, well, we'll help you now. After 70 years of not doing anything, we'll come and help. So they tell them they don't need their help. And then immediately we see the true heart of the Samaritans come out. And from that point on, they begin to oppose the rebuilding of the city. They don't want to see Jerusalem rebuilt because they don't want to see this tribe of Judah gain strength. It'll be another competitor for them. Yeah. So if you can't, it's kind of the opposite. If you can't beat them, join them. It's like if you can't join them, then try to beat them. A little bit opposite there. So we see the opposition of the Samaritans. You can read the details, of course, there in chapter 4 and 5. They actually do prevent them from rebuilding that temple. And so those first 7 chapters, you have this first return of people, about 50,000 people with this guy named Zerubbabel, and they begin the building of the temple. They don't start on the city just to rebuild the temple, and the people are probably just living around in lean-tos or tabernacle type things, and they get stuck because they have so much opposition. And then we see there in chapter 7, there's a second wave of people, and Ezra is a part of that second wave of people. As you can see that in the middle of page 59, Ezra led another group of Jews from Persia to Jerusalem to reinforce the ones who were already there. And his chief ministry was to teach the law and to organize the worship. And it says there, traditions say that Ezra was the founder of the synagogue. Now, the synagogue are just the temporary temples because, if they didn't have a temple, they couldn't do the sacrifices and all those things. So instead of doing that, they started building these little small study centers or Jewish centers, which you still have around the world today, called synagogues. And Ezra was one of the first people in the Persian areas. He started building these synagogues, which are outside of Jerusalem, places where people could go to read the Torah, the law of God, and so forth. So in the book of Ezra, we find the Israelites are continuing a practice that had been a major factor in the nation's downfall in the period of the kings. What is this malpractice? Now, who can remember that? What was one of the major things that the kings did that led to the cultural and moral and religious collapse of the kingdom? Yeah, they were married, right? David kind of started, right? He even before he became king, he had 4 wives before he even took the throne. And some of them were of convenience, some of them for different reasons. And of course, Solomon took it to a whole nother level. And then of course, we see it come to its worst fruition when Ahab marries a foreigner named Jezebel, who's Phoenician. She comes in, brings all these, and she destroys all of the worship. And so, but we see here that practice is still just going on. And so Ezra, you'll see there in chapter 10, there's a whole section of this book. I skipped that one. I'm sorry.
The prophets.
I skipped the prophets. We're going to get to them later anyways.
Can you say it?
Haggai and Zechariah. So, of course, these are Haggai and Zechariah. These are the ones that we're going to get to in our books of prophets. And whenever we get to them, we'll come back and what we're going to do is go back and when we get to these books, kind of like we're doing with Esther next week, we're going to pull out this guy and we're going to look at where he is in history. So when we get to the books of Haggai and Zechariah, we'll actually come back to this point in time so we can remember that it was during the time of Ezra and Zerubbabel in particular that they were writing. Okay, now the thing I meant to talk about, that they were marrying pagan wives. And so Ezra kind of draws a line in the sand and says, no more. And you'll notice there in parentheses afterwards, we tend to think, well, that's kind of racism, but it was religious purism. And you could marry foreign wives if they were followers of Jehovah. And of course, we see that through Rahab and Ruth. That's always been that way. But you couldn't marry a wife who didn't have your beliefs. And of course, that's continued into the New Testament, right? When it says you shouldn't be unequally what? Yoked. And so, and there's consequences that happen to that. And so it's just not God's design. His design for a family is that you have a believing husband, a believing wife, united together in marriage. Because what happens often when you have parents that don't agree on that, then what happens is that the kids have no idea. They know to one parent, sometimes it's not important at all, and to the other parent it's very important. So the kids grow up, and it's not an ideal situation, to say the least. And so, so that's something that has continued on to this day. Now the book of Nehemiah. So when you think Ezra, you think what? One word, temple. And when you think Nehemiah, you think one thing, the walls. The walls, that's right. All right, book of Nehemiah. So the temple was rebuilt, but the city walls weren't rebuilt. And what that means is it was still, raider, you wouldn't be safe. So if you were living in the city and there are no walls, you didn't feel safe because, there wasn't an organized sort of police force and these sort of things. So if you were in the city, people, raiders, robbers, it was just kind of chaos inside the city. So they had the temple built, but the city walls were not built. And so Nehemiah, as we see, he begins the return of yet another wave of people. And these people are going to return to build the walls. And this is another famous leader named Artaxerxes. And by the way, we didn't do this. We'll do it a little bit later. If you have your Bible open between Ezra 6 and 7, it's between chapter 6 and chapter 7. We'll talk about this again next week when Esther lived and her thing. So it's actually right between those chapters. So if you want to make that note, and we'll do it again next week in Ezra. The Esther that we look at next week takes place between chapter 6 and 7 in Ezra. So the book of Nehemiah, they do overlap. Ezra and Nehemiah overlap. They were there at the same time. And Nehemiah, he is, if you remember Joseph, Joseph was in prison, and there were two guys that came, and he interpreted their dreams. One was a baker, and the other one was a cupbearer. And a cupbearer we talk about on Sunday is like a butler. They were a close confidant, very trusted by the king. So Nehemiah was the cupbearer, or like the butler for, remember that huge empire? For the king of that huge empire. And if you want to read the story, the first couple of chapters is just very moving. Nehemiah's brother comes back, and he asks his brother, what is Jerusalem like? Everybody's hoping. He said he was just in tears. He said, I just can't believe it. I mean, they've kind of got the temple rebuilt, but the town is in shambles. There's no safety. There's nothing. And the people living there are living in fear. And Nehemiah is so downtrodden that he comes into work, and the emperor asks him, what's the matter? And he shares that story with the emperor. And so, of course, the emperor gives him permission, and not just permission, gives him legal license to get lumber, to recruit workers, and to prevent the other people from disturbing him, although there's still a big conflict that happens there. Okay, and that's the next answer, of course. You can see there on page 60 that King Artaxerxes, who's the king of that huge Persian empire, gives Nehemiah permission.
So Cyrus just goes away.
Yeah, he's I can't remember exactly. It might be his son or those. There's often palace intrigue that goes on there,
He was there in the first year.
Yes.
And then now we're in.
And now we're in Artaxerxes. So I was looking up.
The year of Artaxerxes.
Right, and so there's some overlap, and that's a good time to plug our Home and Bible Atlas. That answer is in this book, Tom. The exact dates are in here. And I don't know them off the top of my head, but we can look them up together. Or you can get on Amazon, used book. You can find these for about $5 if you want used. Or you can get the new ones for about $20. But it is nice when you're reading a Bible. That's why I keep plugging those. Sometimes it's hard to put those parts together. And this covers all this history and those maps that I saw, but it specifically focuses on the names of the people in the Bible. So it would have that. It would explain, especially when there's a question like that, it always makes pains to make sure it explains that. So I don't have a good answer, but we can find it. But yes, it's one of the successors of Cyrus. And so the book of Nehemiah is about him coming back after he's given authority to collect all the things. And of course, as he gets there, they have a lot of opposition. And you'll remember the famous passage where he tells all the people, and by the way, they're working in families, women, men are working, the singers are working, basically everybody is working to try to rebuild this wall. And it gets to the point where they have a trowel in one hand, and what do they have in the other hand? A spear or a weapon they have in the other hand, because that's kind of the mindset. People often use that as often that's how we serve the Lord, is we are ready to defend. We know that we're under attack. We have an enemy, but at the same time, we're always busy about the Lord's work. And so we have that picture. And of course, a lot of management books, people draw a lot of management issues because he's a great delegator and organizer of how to get all this stuff done. And of course, they complete the wall, and that creates a revival of the people. And you can see bottom of page 60, it says that when the walls are completed, Ezra returns to Jerusalem. He had returned back and back to where he had come from in exile, and then he came back again. And then they have the temple, they have the walls built, and he stands on a pulpit of wood and reads the law to the people. And the reading of God's word sparks a revival. And then we see again a feast. It's going to sound familiar. They celebrate again. And they institute it on an annual basis, which is this same Feast of Tabernacles. And if you've forgotten, of course, on page 18, we made a list of those. And so the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, like I said, it's a lot of history, and of course plays into things that are going on. It's referred to a lot. But one of the great things to remember, especially when we have a day, you know, if you're watching the news lately, and there's all kinds of questions with nuclear powers, North Korea, and of course us and China and all these things. Isn't it a wonderful, just why can Christians, we have this resource of peace that other people don't know. And that's why it's important to know these stories. Here we have all this, and by the way, like the Babylonian people, these were bad dudes. I mean, I told you some stories last week about what they did to their enemies and the horrible, horrible things we do. But this is the theme of the Bible. It always shows that even in the midst of the horrible scenes in these empires, who is sovereignly still working his plan? God is working his plan. And then the other amazing thing we'll see, especially next week, and still true today, no matter what happens. All right, if our economy collapses, if something happens, America declines, guess what? God's ways are always the best ways, no matter what's going on around us. And so that's going to be the theme through all these thousands and thousands and thousands of years of history. As Christians, we can draw on this history and this resource and the confidence that knowing, whatever's going around us, that throughout thousands of years of history, the ways that God has set out for us, the lifestyle, the rules, what things he wants us to do, his word is always beneficial to our life. And we see even in this, as we're going to see especially next week, that we stick out because we live according to God's ways, and according to those ways match the way in which God has made the world. And so not just a spiritual side to our faith, but there's this very practical side that the way Christians live impacts our society as salt and light. And so that's Lesson 13, Nehemiah and Ezra.